indulgence in them. The grace of thy Holy Spirit to open the eyes of our hearts and our minds to thy gospel, for thou art a good and merciful man. We friend in God.
Amen.
Amen.
We went through and studied the Holy Prophets, and we found that the Holy Prophets were really very much concerned about the way the poor, the widow, and the orphan and strangers were being treated in Israel. And they warned that this is one of the ways that people betrayed God and betrayed the covenant with God, was that they didn't take care of the dispossessed and the weak who were in their midst. And that would, God's grace would be deprived to those people who didn't care for the poor, the weak, and the homeless, and all of these other people. But we went through the Gospels before that, but we'll start to go through the Epistles, the readings from the Holy Apostles. First of all, of course, the book of the Acts, which is something of a history of the early church, and particularly of Apostle Paul. But we want to say a couple of things about this first. When we talk about the Old Law, Apostle Paul is going to say a great deal about the law from the Old Testament. And he's going to remind us that we're not subject to the law of the Old Testament. The law from the Old Testament doesn't really mean anything to us. And somebody will always say, oh yes, but surely the Ten Commandments. Well, not really, because Christ replaced the Ten Commandments with a higher law that contains the Ten Commandments. In the first place, the Ten Commandments that most people quote, or that they put on stone in courthouses and things down in America, is not the Ten Commandments that were placed in the Ark. They're teachings that Moses gave verbally. They were never written on stone by God. But they were his verbal teaching before he went up to the mountain and received the actual Ten Commandments, which have nothing, practically no connection at all with the Ten Commandments that we usually think about. And so the thing is that Christ did replace those Ten Commandments with his 4 moral imperatives, and you see that the only possible way to actually fulfill the Ten Commandments is, as Christ said, to love God with all of your being and to have empathy for your neighbor, to love your neighbor. You can fulfill any kind of laws or commandments because they're laws and commandments. But any pagan can do that. Any atheist can do that. Any communist or Nazi can do that. So it's no great accomplishment to fulfill some laws just because they're laws. And Christ is telling us that you fulfill the laws only when you fulfill them through love. You do not fulfill the laws when you fulfill them just because they're a law. But we should have learned that in the beginning, because we knew the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain offered his sacrifice because it was a law, and God turned it down. He didn't accept it. But Abel offered his sacrifice from the heart, and God accepted it, because it was offered with love. And Cain's was offered just because it was a law, a rule, or regulation. You had to do this. That's why God said, if you had offered rightly, he doesn't say if you'd offered the right thing, but if you had offered it rightly, that is from the heart, I would accept it. But you offer something because it's law, that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't need your offerings. And he says it later too. The world is mine and the fullness thereof. If I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. I'll have mercy and not sacrifice. And then Christ reminds us of that when he says to the Pharisees, look, go and learn what it means. I'll have mercy and not sacrifice. But they didn't, And this is why when Apostle Paul, from the beginning, we're already hearing about why the Old Testament law is not to be revisited by us. Because there's a higher law. We're not under law, we're under grace. And this is the consistent message of Apostle Paul throughout the epistles. When we look at the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 15 we see that this question arose, and the apostles met together to decide the question. And what they decided was those who were not Jews but were converts to Christianity didn't have to fulfill the law. It was no longer obligatory for them. And we'll discuss that obviously as we go through and hear exactly what Apostle Paul says. So people usually quote the Old Testament when they want to use it to hurt somebody, when they want to find a reason to cause pain or suffering to another person. They use the Old Testament law. They do not use the Old Testament law if it applies to them. If it applies to me, I don't have anything to do with it. If I can use it against you, yes, it's right here, it says it. Now, Jesus said that the law would not pass away, not one crossing of a T and not one dotting of an I, would pass away until all things were fulfilled. And then on the cross he said, it is finished. All things are fulfilled. And when after I read the prayer before the Anvon, O God, who blesses those who bless thee and those who love the beauty of thy house, you return to where the proscomedias, where the holy gifts have been placed, and you say, O Christ, our true God, who didst fulfill all the law of the economy, all the law and the prophets, thou who did thyself fulfill all the Father's economia. And by that we confess that everything has been fulfilled, it's completed, the law is gone. And I want to emphasize this because Paul mentions it so much, and we're going to hear it so often in the Epistles of Apostle Paul. I mean, I think everybody has noticed that the only people that Christ was really stern with were the ones who thought they were righteous. He was never sharp, he was never harsh, he was never stern with anybody who was just a plain ordinary sinner like us. He was only stern and sharp to those who were righteous, who thought they were righteous. And you see the same Pharisaism, that's why I say in the Orthodox Church we know we're the new Israel because we have all the Pharisees that the old Israel had. We have all of this hair-splitting condemnation and criticism that the Pharisees had. The Pharisees were very, very concerned about being ritually proper. So among the traditions that Christ just condemned the traditions themselves. Among those traditions, when you woke up in the morning, it was absolutely obligatory. You had to place your right foot on the floor first, never the left foot. Then you could put on I think you put on the left sandal, but you couldn't lace it. You put on the right sandal, you lace it, and then you could go back and lace the left sandal. That's how finely tuned they had become. And it's like some of our people, he bowed while he made the cross, that meant he broke the cross. Sometimes you bow while you're making the cross, and some of the Russians will say, oh my God, he broke the cross, by bowing while he was making the cross. And we get these goofy superstitions like that. And then somebody will run around if some woman's not quite properly dressed and say something nasty to her. Or maybe the children make a little noise in church and somebody says, can't you shut those kids? It's sort of like all these petty little things that are going on. Oh, he doesn't make the sign of the cross right. Oh, he doesn't know when to make the proper prostrations. Or he made a prostration on Thursday night, and the wrong kind though. You're supposed to make a different kind on Thursday night. And people worry about these things and never worry about the greater things of the law. And the greater things of the law are the fact that all the law and the prophets are encompassed in this: to love God with all of your being and to have empathy for your neighbor. But think about all the petty little nonsense things, and sometimes the whole church becomes frozen, like driving through Russia in roadless spring or something in a tank. It becomes bogged down and can't move because of petty little nonsense. And that's our tragedy. Pettiness is probably the greatest enemy of the Orthodox Church today. Pettiness inside. But it's also one of the greatest hindrances to Christianity's surviving in the modern world. And I didn't realize until the American Synod of Bishops, the sort of pan synod that all the jurisdictions meet together. Down in America, 60% of the young people leave the church every year. You know, you're baptizing all these children, they reach a certain age, 60% of them are gone from the church. So, two of the worst possible priests, the nastiest, meanest, most hate-filled priest that I've ever heard in the States, are going to get together and try to get these 60% back again. And how are they going to do it? With the malice and the hatred that they constantly preach. So let's take a look at Apostle Paul now. In the book of the Acts, of course, Paul is the one who brings up this question about saying that converts don't need to fulfill the law. The only two things that the Synod in Jerusalem posted on them was said, don't commit adultery and don't consume blood. Some blood sausages out. That's in the New Testament. But these two things were all imposed. And things strangled or things that had, you know, blood. But growing up on a farm, of course, I realized that you never, if you were going to butcher an animal for food, you couldn't strangle it, and you had to bleed it, because otherwise it was dangerous. Those two things were just observably dangerous. But they didn't even impose the restriction about eating pork on the non-Christians. I mean the non-Jewish Christians. So, and remember Apostle Peter, when he went down to Caesarea, and he had the vision on the rooftop, and he saw the cloth let down, and every kind of unclean beast and animal and everything was in it. And the angel said, slay and eat. And he said, not so, Lord, because I've never eaten anything that's unclean. And the angel answers, how dare you say the things are unclean when God has made them clean? So what he's really revealing to him is the Gentiles, because for a Jew, anybody who was not a Jew was a sinner. It didn't matter what kind of life you lived, if you weren't a Jew, you were a sinner. Because they understood that sinner meant one who's alienated, one who's outside. But now God has said that there are no outsiders. Nobody's outside. Everybody's to come inside. And you don't impose on them the Jewish laws in it. We have plenty of guidance from the New Testament. We have some guidance from the Old Testament, but we also have some very ugly and hideous things in the Old Testament. They're not law of God, they're simply Semitic tribal law, which was kind of systematized. Do you think God really commanded people that you could sell your daughters into slavery? But not your sons, of course, only the daughters. That was a Semitic custom, that long before there were any Hebrews. Do you think God really commanded that you could beat your slave almost to death, but not quite to death? You stop and think about what the Old Testament law actually says. That you can actually do. Take your teenage boys and stone them to death at the gate if they're rebellious. I mean, how many of us males in this room would have survived? We would have all been stoned to death at the gate, because we were all rebellious at one time in it. So we have to be cautious. You can't say the Old Testament laws that I like are valid, but the Old Testament laws that I don't like, well, yeah, they're not really valid. See what liars and hypocrites we become? That's what that is. We're just liars and hypocrites when we select elements of the Old Testament law that we think should be enforced, but we don't enforce other elements of the same Old Testament law. Just liars and hypocrites. So you see why 60% of the young people are leaving. They're tired of being lied to. They're tired of being, seeing the hypocrisy and the bigotry in it. So Apostle Paul, when he sets out to preach, every time he turns around, he's being spat upon, he's being beaten, he's being cursed, he's being thrown out of the city, he's being thrown in jail, he's being falsely accused, he's being thrown into the sea to drown. And how can he endure all this stuff? You know? And never curses or condemns the people who are doing all this to him. because he really understood the gospel, and he understood that you can't preach the gospel with pride and arrogance. You have to preach it in another way. You have to be willing to suffer and endure persecution, humiliation, degradation, and hatred for the sake of the gospel, because you have to have some kind of humility. And that's why Apostle Paul, was going blind. We find from one of his letters that he couldn't sign all of his letters because he couldn't see that well. And so at one point he says, well, lest he think more highly of himself than he ought to, unless he become puffed up, God's given him a thorn in the flesh to buffet him. And we find out later that he was actually practically blind. Little by little he was simply going blind. And in one or two of his letters he says that I signed the letter with my own hand. Of course, Paul didn't write all the letters. That's why they have a different style. Because, the letter from Rome is, he had a scribe named Tertius, who was Terenti, who wrote the letter. Paul simply certified it or signed it, because he couldn't even write the letters by himself anymore. He couldn't see well enough. And I believe Timothy wrote some of them for him, but somebody was always dictating, somebody else was writing. And the reason I want to bring that up is because you always find critics of the New Testament who say, well, Paul didn't actually write this letter, didn't write that letter because the style's different. Of course it's different, because the scribes wrote in their style when he dictated to them in Greek. You don't notice it in English, but you notice it in Greek. And Paul signed some of the letters, others he doesn't. But we find out at one point that Paul's eyesight was so bad that he couldn't even write his own letters. He couldn't see well enough. And by that time, of course, he would have been sort of led around, or had to be in the company of somebody to travel. He obviously could see some, but not very well. So Paul is constantly suffering and constantly enduring humiliation and degradation and spitefulness in order to live and preach the gospel. We do not hear Paul standing and cursing other people. And this is something to pay attention to. He can be sharp, he can be stern, and he can state things very, very clearly and very categorically, but he doesn't do it with hate and malice. It's the same way we can state the faith clearly and directly, but we have to, as Paul said at one place, be ye imitators of me as I'm an imitator of Christ. So if we're going to preach, we can take a lesson from the greatest of all the preachers, Apostle Paul, and see how he approached these things. So the book of Acts gives us a history of the early church. And of course, mostly we have the history of Paul because his disciple Luke, who traveled with him, we know that Luke was a physician, and we can see that from the Gospel of Luke because in Greek, people who study it carefully, there's medical diction, and it uses medical structure, medical form of analyzing or writing about things, so we can clearly see that Luke the physician is the one who wrote it. And the same in the book of Acts. Luke is the one who actually wrote the story. And he was traveling with Paul, so we have mostly Paul's story. And we know very little about the other apostles, except Peter was in Alexandria. Peter was in Antioch and also in Alexandria, more in Alexandria than any place else. We know that Thomas went to the east, and in fact he went as far as India, because the Thomas Christians still exist in India from that time. And we know basically Matthias went to the area that was Assyria before, around Nineveh. So we know the history that we know Apostle Andrew. I mean, we know for certain that Andrew traveled around the complete circle of the Black Sea area. And what he did, he visited all the Jewish communities there first, because all the apostles went to Jewish communities first. And all the way down, we know that he was in what's today Dobroja, Romania, and he was in Crimea, and we found ruins of the most ancient churches from the 1st century in the southern part of what's today Russia. In fact, they were called Zion rooms, like the upper room where Christ first broke the bread and the wine. And we even found the pechat, the seal that they put on Prospero from very early, maybe the 3rd century, in all of these areas. So we know a good bit about many of the apostles. We know the most about Apostle James, because Apostle James was a priest in the temple. He was a very well-known person, and there are many external records of Apostle James. James and Paul are therefore the two best known in historical details. So the Acts of the Apostle mentions, just in passing, James and John and Peter, but we have Paul's story and Paul's letters. We have epistles by Apostle Peter, likely written by Mark, who was his disciple and traveled with him. And Mark would have written what Peter had to say. And people often ask, how could the apostles who were not educated write these epistles? It's simple. They dictated to whoever was with them, the same as Paul. Paul and James are very highly educated people, both of them. And we know how they could have written their letters. So I think it's interesting to realize that Paul and James were the only ones with a really high education, a higher education. And Matthew, who was a publican, had some kind of education, but not much. The rest of the apostles didn't. They were really fishermen. They may not have been able to read, for that matter. But nevertheless, we have the records of them written by other people. Even the Gospels, we say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and Mark is really writing down, or whoever wrote it anyway, is writing down what Peter dictated, or the story the way Peter recounted the Gospel. And Matthew certainly could write, because he had to fill out tax reports, so he was literate in it. And John, I rather suspect John might have been the most intelligent of them, and I think was the most spiritually alert. He could see more deeply into what Christ taught. And when it says he was the apostle who Christ loved, when we mention that, it's almost certainly because John was more open to understand the fullness of the gospel. And in the epistles that John wrote later, you can see the depth of that understanding. Remember, it's John the theologian, who we celebrate today, who told us that whoever still has fear has simply not yet learned how to love perfectly, because love drives out fear. So, and that's a theme in Apostle Paul, who says that we've not been given over in bondage to a spirit of fear, but to a spirit of freedom in it. So the history of the book of Acts, which you should all read this evening or this week, it is going to give us a lot of insight into what Paul had to endure to preach the gospel, and we can surmise that the other apostles had to endure the same thing in it. One thing's for sure, that the apostles could not have bought the first century equivalent of a Rolex watch. They could not have had the first century equivalent of their own private jet. They couldn't have had the first century equivalent of a high salary as preachers. They couldn't have even had a chariot, and perhaps not even to afford a horse, a mule at best, but not a horse, which was very expensive in those days. So there was a whole world of difference in the way the gospel was presented and preached at the time of the apostles. And I think I'm going to pause at that a little bit, because I'd like to see if anybody has any questions from what, I mean, some of you have read the whole New Testament, I believe. And what things come up in your mind when you read it, though? I mean, what questions arise? Yeah.
Why does Jesus call John, the apostle, his beloved? He says, my beloved John. Yeah. And he doesn't say it to the other apostles. It's not like Jesus didn't love the other the same. But for some reason he specifically says it to John.
Yeah, yeah, because John understood the deepest and the most profoundly. It means that John's heart was the most open to what the teachings of Christ. And he grasped and understood them more deeply than the others. That's why we call him the theologian. because he really understood. I mean, it's John who tells us the deeper mysteries of Christ, and who understood what Christ was saying and understood that Christ was literally the incarnation. And that's why John begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. The other apostles couldn't have written that in it. And people think, well, he's using some kind of Greek philosophy. But it isn't really true, because during the Hasmonean period, that would have been, you remember we talked about the Maccabee rebellion, and before the Herods took over. That would have been at the end of the kingdoms of Alexander the Great. So the Hasmoneans were the family that supplied the high priests and the kings at the time. During that period and the period of the Herods, there was a great debate among the rabbis in Israel, because they realized that there was a trinity in the Old Testament. They couldn't sort of sort it out, but they realized there were three persons spoken of. When God acted, there were three different persons who were acting. And they couldn't sort of rivet that, but they're perfectly aware that one of those was the Word. And the Word is active person in the Old Testament in many specific instances. And the Shekinah, the Spirit, the Spirit of God, is acting as a person. So they came to the conclusion that God simply related to men in through three different personifications, or like we would say emanations. But that it was just three different ways that God acted toward men, but they were all three active. And the Word was supremely active in the Old Testament, even in the creation story. So they had this concept of the Word of God and couldn't quite place it. And so what John is doing is he's taking this debate that was going on among the rabbis. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And saying that, well, you're not talking. In fact, the debate was called the Second God Debate, because the Word was so active, individually active as a sort of person in the Old Testament. And the rabbis were trying to figure this out and place it. And John sees it rather clearly, that the Word refers to God incarnate, when God actually works together with people, with mankind. It's the Son and Word of God who's actually the one who's active and working with mankind. And yet he can understand that we're not saying three gods, we're saying three manifestations, or as we call three hypostasis. The word person is confusing. I don't like to use the word God in three persons. It's God in three hypostasis, because it doesn't confuse the matter. But anyway, Apostle John's the only one who could clearly see this and understand it. And that's why John was receiving much more deeply and much more profoundly than the other apostles. Even Peter didn't grasp the depth of the theology of it, the depth of the revelation, the way John did. And yet Peter understood that in the end, that we could become participants in God through grace. So, anybody else have any other questions on that? Yeah.
In the literature, I met an opinion that Apostle John is the main source of Orthodox inspiration. Are you agree with this?
Yeah. John the theologian is really kind of the main source of our theological understanding.
Yeah. And
Luke is our historical understanding.
mm-hmm.
And but John really is, that's why they specifically name him the theologian.
And are you agree that John's teaching is more metaphorical, less literal, more metaphorical?
Yeah. Well, it kind of has to be, because it's dealing with mysteries that can't be put into human words.
Yeah, and this is from where his depths come,
Yeah.
from metaphors,
Yeah.
right?
Well, depth really always comes from metaphor. You know, the older the literature, the older the language, the richer it is in metaphor. Any ancient language, like ancient Hebrew, or ancient Egyptian, or ancient Hindi, I mean, we don't know never deciphered the Dravidian language, but ancient Tamil. Tamil is the oldest continuously spoken language on earth. But the older the language, the richer in metaphor it is. Any literature from any country, anywhere. And one of the problems with our fundamentalist literalists is that they try to literalize all the metaphors. And when you literalize a metaphor, you create an idolatry. You know, that's why Metellinus and other of our main theologians of this century remind us that when we talk about hell, we're talking about a metaphor. We're talking about the metaphor of Gehenna, because hell is never mentioned anywhere in the Scripture, Old or New Testament. It doesn't exist. But we're talking about Gehenna. It's a metaphor based on the valley outside Jerusalem and referring back to the time of Prophet Jeremy or Prophet Jeremiah. But when we talk about hell and we take a Western or scholastic view, which some of our Orthodox people have, because I would say that 80% of Orthodox people haven't got a real idea of what the Orthodox Church teaches. They really don't know that much about the faith. And perhaps one reason is nobody pays attention to Vespers and Matins of the 12 great feast days. Or it's served in a language that nobody can understand, like ancient Greek for the Greeks and Church Slavonic in Russia. And you know, we've seen real examples of this, but they don't really know what the teaching of the church is. And when you talk about hell and you borrow the Western concept of hell, okay, hell's supposed to be this horrible, this eternal fire that burns forever, and everybody's consciously being burned, and the demons are being rewarded for their wickedness by being allowed to do what they love to do best, torture human beings. So in this Western concept of hell, the demons get a reward, people get punished. And that means that God couldn't be present there, doesn't it? As Metellinus says, to suggest that there was any place that existed at all where God wasn't present is an idolatry. The heaven and hell are the same place. It's a matter of our conscience and how we receive it. It's the same as thinking that the worlds in the universe are going to be literally destroyed. There's no basis for believing that at all. When we say that everything will be consumed by fire, what we mean is the glory of God, the presence of the glory of God. It's going to transfigure the universe. So we talk about the transfigured universe, not the destroyed universe. And because the words that are used metaphorically, literalists will try to literalize them and say that the whole universe is going to be burnt up, burnt to a cinder, or destroyed. But there's no reason at all to believe something like that in it, because it's a metaphor. And John, of course, is very rich in metaphor because he's saying things that can't be said in ordinary language. You know, it's rather like quantum mechanics, and I think, honestly, that slips my mind now, whether it was Niels Bohr or Heisenberg, said that in quantum physics, we've gone beyond the level where human languages can express reality. So we have to use mathematical formalisms. The mathematics of physics are metaphors about things that can't be expressed in human languages. At the same time, St. Gregory of Nyssa tells us that the doctrine of the Trinity is a metaphor. He says the mystery exceeds the capacity of human languages to express it. And the doctrine of the Trinity is only the best words we can find in human languages to describe a relationship. See, when the West made it concrete, that's where the West gets confused about the doctrine of the Trinity and why they've had so many problems with it. And not realizing that this isn't a real expression in human language of the essence of or nature of God. It's beyond human languages, so we have the metaphor which reflects a relationship in it. And John does the same thing in his Gospel. He's very clearly revealing something profound and necessary to us, but human languages don't have the capacity, so we have to use metaphors. And even like talking about the Garden of Eden, Paradise is simply an ancient Persian word for any walled garden. Every walled garden is paradiso. So you have to use a metaphor to describe the way the world was at the time. And I remember the late neo-Gnostic teacher, Seraphim Rose, among other problems, he was describing paradise as being a beautiful garden where when fruit fell from the tree, it never rotted, it simply immediately became sweet, fresh soil. But St. John Damascus tells us that paradise was filled with light. So paradise is anywhere where God and man are present together. Anywhere where God and man are present together is paradise. It's not a literal garden, a literal place, a literal spot. That is paradise. There's a place where the first humans lived, and it was paradise because they were present together with God. That's why it says that God walked with them in the cool of the evening. You know, you don't necessarily have to take that literal either. He was simply present with them. And that's what made it paradise. You know, if paradise were only luscious fruit trees and rich, deep growth, you have paradise all over the place. It's not, but that's not what it is. It's the presence of God and filled with the light of God's glory and God's love is what makes it paradise. So it's a metaphor. The Garden of Eden is a metaphor too. So.
Well, I was gonna makes me think. Hell cannot be a place because if it's a place, it had to be created, or God only created good.
Yep.
He never created anything bad.
Right, that's the whole thing. Yeah.
Another-
God never created a fiery pit to torture people in. It's a condition that people, you know, even like when St. Mark of Ephesus, as at the Council of Florence, where he's debating with the Roman Catholic cardinals, and of course they were trying to prove purgatory, and he was telling them why purgatory was an absurdity, just like the telonia, the aerial toll house, is just a Gnostic nonsense. It's a total absurdity. It says heaven and hell don't exist yet, and they can't exist till the second coming, because heaven and hell are both psychological conditions. The one is being in the presence, encompassed by the love and the glory of Christ, and the other is being left out of that love. And that's why some of the fathers tell us that, and I can't remember at the moment whether it's on Ephraim or Isaki or Isaac, who tells us that the fire of hell is bitter regret because of the sin against love. And they both tell us that no sin is greater than the sin against love. No sin burns more deeply than the sin against love. As when, you know, a spouse betrays another spouse, even when your best friend betrays you, the pain that you feel because of that betrayal, but the pain of guilt that the other one feels because of the betrayal is also a fire that burns in them. And the bitter regret like today, in the gospel reading, the servant who received the one, I think a talent is a silver coin, not a gold coin, who received it and just buried it in the ground and did nothing with it, is cast him into the outer darkness. In other words, he's alienated from the light of the love and glory of God. But doesn't say anything about cast him into a pit of fire, just cast him into the outer darkness. And the same with at the wedding banquet, when the person shows up without a wedding garment, is bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. Because he's closed himself off from being present in the love and glory of God, of the wedding banquet, of the heavenly bridegroom and the earthly bride in it. So, but these metaphors, when people have literalized them, they create real tragedies in faith and belief. And sometimes when you see the more literal and more fundamentalist people become, sometimes we lose some of those young people who leave the church, leave because the priests are teaching something literalistic and fundamentalistic. And they're trying to impose right-wing politics as if it was part of the faith. In America in particular, a lot of the priests try to impose ultra-right-wing politics as if they were an element of the faith. I hear complaints every year when there's an election, especially when there's a federal election. I'll get any number of letters or tearful notes from people where the priest is standing on the ambon telling people for whom they should vote and for which party they should vote. And inevitably the priests who do that are saying, Democrats are all atheists, Republicans are all Christians, so we have to vote for Donald Trump because he's one of the greatest Christians on earth. After all, he's a Republican, and becoming a Republican is the same as being born again. That's sort of the, you know, like Richard Nixon. I remember I was at seminary, Meleti was there with us, and we were told that we had a moral obligation to vote for Richard Nixon, who made his fortune by the most crooked and devious means. But part of why he was impeached, it wasn't just Watergate, it was because they found out that he was a swindler and an embezzler and that he'd made his fortune as a crook. You know, his famous last words before he left the White House was, I am not a crook. But he was, in fact, a crook. And, you know, then we listen to the Nixon tapes, and we find out that he has one of the most vile vocabularies. That only Donald Trump comes anywhere close to being as vile and vulgar as Richard Nixon was. I mean, he wasn't an entirely bad president, as a matter of fact. He had a lot of very good qualities of leadership and as a president. In fact, in his second term, if he hadn't got impeached, he was going to introduce, it would have been Nixon care instead of Obamacare. He had a really, really progressive healthcare system that he wanted to introduce. And because it was introduced by a black man, it's no good, it has to be defeated. But if it had been introduced by Nixon, it would have been a revelation from God. The same thing. Because deep down inside, America hates black people. That's why the police brutalize and bash and shoot them dead. And nobody gets upset. If you shot a white 12-year-old dead in a park who was playing with a cap pistol, you know, the police officer would likely have got the death penalty or at least life in prison. But because he shot a black kid, nothing happened. See, that's the problem with this. And yet we still have people telling people, this is what you have to vote for because this is what's truly Christian. See? So anyway, we can't stop because he wants to do the believer. Not only start on that, except to say that we need to pay attention to Apostle Paul and not to these right-wing goofies who preach the stuff from the ambon down in America. And listen to what Apostle Paul has to say. And whether he speaks that way, whether he talks that way about other people, or whether Jesus Christ does. That's what we have to pay attention to. Anyway, we better go.
It is truly to call thee blessed Theotokos, famous and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest first to God the Word, true Theotokos, we magnify thee. Glory to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, bloody cause.
God is with us by his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, and unto ages of ages.
Amen. Is Meleti